On Sunday mornings, we come together for worship. And yes, it is a little different today because we're able to be in person, but for me, I've been with you for a little over a year, and yes, every Sunday we come together for worship, and each of us brings with us a tapestry of life experiences. And it's into this varied mix of hopes and hurts and struggles and joys that this story in Mark's gospel speaks. Both of the stories involve women in crisis. And it's interesting that we don't even know them by their names, but just by their needs. Both daughters of Abraham. They're not outsiders, or at least they didn't begin as outsiders, but now they are both excluded, subject to the taboos around that mysterious power of lifeblood and the even more mysterious and seemingly inevitable power of death. Bleeding women and dead girls should be avoided at all costs. How will the story end? It's so interesting that we don't know. We don't know what happens to the little girl. We don't know what happens to the now healed woman. And who do you relate to? To the daughter who was, to all intents and purposes, dead, but is now alive and given a second chance at life? Perhaps you can relate to the hemorrhaging woman who finally has cause to rejoice after every conceivable medical option has been tried. Finally, she can rejoice. How will their stories end? The invitation is not just an intellectual exercise. It's an invitation for us to consider how our own stories will end. Will you pray with me? Oh, gracious God, help us to become masters of ourselves so that we might become the servants of others. Take our minds and think with them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hands and work with them, and take our hearts and set them on fire with your Spirit. Amen. Jairus' daughter, if she was so blessed, she probably outlived her father and grew up perhaps to become a parent herself. The hemorrhaging woman, finally declared clean, was able to return to a full life, to relationships, to connections, to community, all of which had been denied her for 12 years. Or did she? This is a thing that sticks with me. Because honestly, were the ruptured relationships of 12 years of being an outcast, were they just resolved like that? And here on this last Sunday in June, Pride Month, I'm curious about the outcasts. I'm curious about her. It's not enough for us to read this gospel lesson as a simple miracle story granting cures to earthly diseases. I think this is an invitation to dig deeper so that we might understand this story deeper and for our own lives. In the story of the hemorrhaging woman, We hear how desperate she is and the lengths she'll go to find wholeness. And I'm using the word wholeness intentionally rather than a physical disease, because her condition had isolated her. And we perhaps could relate to times in our lives when we have felt isolated. Perhaps times when we have felt unclean. I am honored and inspired by St. Paul when I read this story. I find myself blessed to be your temporary shepherd, where together you all don't look alike. Living in this community, I've learned that it's really difficult to isolate oneself from others. And that here in this community at St. Paul's, you honor the differences. Your common experience of living with differences, with all the varied life experiences that you hold together. I think it's important to talk about that. And like I said before with the hemorrhaging woman, we don't know how things turned out for her. Did she find her way back into community? I don't think it was easy. How does her story end? So I notice here in this gospel lesson, in this parable, we have a story of a little kid on her deathbed, a frantic father asking an itinerant faith healer to try to heal his daughter. And there's an interruption, and this hemorrhaging woman shows up. Wait a minute. This is not the way things are supposed to go. So right there on the road to one work of mercy, to heal a little girl, Jesus, the multitasker, his mission is interrupted. And it makes me wonder how often we have an agenda personally for our days, and also maybe an agenda for St. Paul's. And maybe that gets interrupted in unexpected and unpredictable ways. And it's an invitation to consider what our response might be to interruptions, to what we think are the more important original plans. I think this parable challenges us to consider our priorities and who and what gets to be top of the list and how we make decisions. Perhaps those who are the most deserving of our attention, well, perhaps they're the least visible. For Jesus, the most important thing in that moment is to face the person who had touched him and to encounter her as a human being and to see her as a human being. And not just as an anonymous touch. Remember, he turns around and says, "Who touched me?" Eugene Peterson, in his translation of the Bible, The Message, he says, "Daughter, you took a risk of faith and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed, be healed of your plague." Jairus' daughter lies dying today in little girls jeopardized by illness, by lack of food and water, and the necessities of life. like safety and security, all things they deserve. And it's no great leap this month, this Pride Month, to lift up the plight of those who are not permitted. We don't want to see them. And also those little girls at the border, those little children who seem to be beyond our concern. Beyond the miraculous healing of the woman experiencing the presence of Jesus, the woman who was bleeding, this perhaps was her true healing. To be able to be fully part of her community again. And I'm not saying it was easy. As long as we're separated along gender lines and along racial lines, there's work to be done. And we're all cut off from the life God intends for us. And we need to make our way back to God. And we can do that by making our way through the crowd, just as that woman did, to be touched by the cloak of Jesus. How many daughters of Abraham, daughters are dying? How many daughters are outcasts? What sort of miracle would it take for us to transform the world's systems, and the hearts of people, so that all children and all outcasts in need can rise up to new life? Amen.